Hi, Chag Sameach. My name is Yosefa Fogel Wruble, and I'm thrilled to be sitting here with
Yael Ziegler.
And we're here to speak a little bit about the Yetziat Mitzrayim story, the initial prakim in the book of Shemot, and a number of elements that appear there that we find really meaningful and that we hope will help enlighten and move you before the Chag. So to start with, we wanted to speak about the makot, about the plagues. There really are multiple ways to look at these plagues, what their purpose was within Mitzrayim. And Yael, why don't we start with talking about that idea?
Okay, well, I mean, I guess the real question about the plagues is the question of why we need 10, right? I mean, it's clear, and the Midrashim know this, and they say this very explicitly, that God could have taken them out of Mitzrayim with one plague. And certainly, even when Moshe goes down to Mitzrayim initially, God says to him, you're going to go down to Paro, Hine anochi makka et bincha bechorecha, right? In Parak Daled, right? So, it's already clear that we're moving towards Makat Bechorot before the story starts. So why do we need these initial 9 plagues? What is the purpose of the buildup?
Yeah.
There are really a lot of different answers are given by the Midrashim. I think the most obvious answer is that it's not just about taking Am Yisrael out of Egypt, but that there's an educational principle involved. And there's also a punitive element, right? One of the things that we see quite a lot in the Parshanim and in the Midrashim is this notion of midah keneged midah, that each one of these plagues comes to punish the Egyptians for something else that they did, that they imposed upon Am Yisrael. And really, the Abarbanel in Parak Zayin goes through each one of the plagues one by one and says, this is in recompense for the following act. I mean, maybe the best example is really the first one, which is that the Nile turns to blood, and that's of course seems to be fitting retribution for the fact that the Egyptians threw the baby boys into the Nile. It's even more than a punishment. It feels like a consequence. Look at what you did. You have turned the Nile into a river of blood.
Right. And another element of the midah keneged midah is this idea also of what these elements represented in the ancient world, right? In the ancient Egyptian world, we had that the Nile was looked at as a god of sorts, that the sun was looked at as a god of sorts. And then we had also plagues that really brought those gods down. And that through this process, which also, again, I'm weaving it through the element of midah keneged midah, but it's almost like a little bit of a separate idea. The idea that this process was a way to bring down the Egyptian pantheon so that the people, in this case the Egyptians and the Israelites, would know who was really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I would relegate that more to the educational idea, which I think is certainly part of the story, and that's of course pasuk, which is mentioned explicitly twice, once in Shemot Parak Yud and then again in Bamidbar, which is Uvelohei Mitzrayim E'aseh Shvatim, right, where God says, I'm going to do judgments with the gods of Egypt. And then within that context, we look at each of the plagues and we say, well, in this plague, the god of the Nile, whose name was actually Happy, is shown to be not actually autonomous or has no strength. Or, the obvious one here is Ra, who is the sun god, a very important god in the Egyptian pantheon, who was powerless when God brings 3 days of darkness upon Egypt. So that certainly is another aspect of the story. I mean, the other educational side of this is that the plagues are there to spread knowledge of God, right? L'man teidu ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz. This notion that Yetziat Hashem, that the knowledge of God is lacking both among Am Yisrael and among the Egyptians, and that these plagues make it very clear that God's presence is very palpably felt in every arena, right? In every sphere. Again, I mean, I think this is also an anti-pagan idea, which is that in Egypt there was this notion, or in all pagan religions, there's this notion that there are different gods that have power over different spheres. And if you look at the story of the plagues, it goes from the water to the land, to the animals, to the people, to the sky. All of the different elements are God brings his power to bear over all the elements, thereby concentrating all power in one all-powerful supreme God, which is an argument for monotheism here.
I think also the need to re-educate and how much we need a re-education becomes incredibly clear after we leave Egypt. Meaning within Egypt, the fact that the Egyptians are the target audience is clear, that because we had to get ourselves out of there. But after that, in the way that we respond in our initial time out of Egypt, the stress that we experienced, the difficulty we had in sort of following those initial steps out of that land and then staying out of there and then not wishing we went back, is really shows us how much we needed that re-education process as well. And there are two different kinds of Yetziat Hashem. Ours obviously will require us to be abide to a moral code, will abide to mitzvot, and the Yetziat Hashem for Egypt, it was enough that it was sort of this awareness or recognition. Our awareness will require us to be in a long-term relationship much more than the Egyptians.
Yeah. I mean, those two types of Yediot, the Yetziat Hashem that is universal and Yetziat Hashem that is national, really appear all over Tanakh. But it starts with Avram, but I think the Yeda, right, the words Yetziat Hashem, which are both internal and meant to be spread, really starts in the Mitzrayim story. I want to make one final point about the plagues, and that is that one of the things that is going on in the plague story is that there's the uncreation of Egypt that's going on. If you look at the words that are used to describe the havoc that is wrought by these plagues, these are all Bereshit Aleph words. These are all words that were about the creation of the world. Eretz, Afar, Adama, Behema, Adam, Esev Asadeh, Etz, all of these different words that are creation words show us that really what's happening in the plague story is that Mitzrayim is being uncreated. And then, of course, the most important stage is Choshech, right? They're left in this kind of primordial darkness, which is Tohu Vavohu. And the goal, I think, one of the goals of the plague story is to suggest that Egypt doesn't deserve that leadership, position, that leadership role that it's had, because it has not led the world towards knowledge of God and towards service of God and towards creating a world of Kedusha, but has rather led the world into darkness.
Right. I think also in that way, it sort of reminds us of God destroying the world by Noach as well. We have sort of these two episodes of recreating the world. And in this case, it's recreating the world, but really to create society so that it becomes a moral society that can then abide to a monotheistic lifestyle. Yeah,
which is how Am Yisrael is positioned at the beginning of Sefer Shemot, right? And they saw Paru, Vayirbu, Vayishritzu, Vayirbu, Vayatzmu, Bim'od Me'od, Vatimalea, Aretzotam. That description of Am Yisrael kind of being created takes us back to Bereshit Perek Aleph, and it positions Am Yisrael in that, at the helm of this
to be the recreation,
sort of new creation, which is of course also why when Moshe is born, Vateroto Kitov, right? And his mother sees him that he's good. And that brings us back to the light that is created at the beginning of Bereshit, which is why Rashi brings the Midrash that when Moshe is born, the house fills with light. And that's the light that we sort of use to go out of Egypt, right? Ha'am ha'olchim b'choshech ra'u or gadol. They leave Egypt behind plunged in darkness, right? Last one out turns out the lights, and then they move towards this new path for Am Yisrael.